Hello, students. Today, our topic is chapter 26, Saving, Investment, and the Financial System. This chapter examines how the financial system works. First, we discuss the large variety of institutions that make up the financial system in our economy. And second, we examine the relationship between the financial system and some key macroeconomic variables, notably saving and investment. Third, we develop a model of the supply and demand for funds in financial markets. In the model, the interest rate is the price that adjusts to balance supply and demand. The model shows how various government policies affect the interest rate and thereby society's allocation of scarce resources. So, what questions are we answering today? What are the main types of financial institutions in the United States economy and what is their function? What are the three kinds of saving? What is the difference between saving and investment? How does the financial system coordinate saving and investment? How do government policies affect saving, investment, and interest rates? So, financial institutions. Financial system is a group of institutions in the economy that help match the saving of one person with the investment of another. In other words, the function of the financial system is to channel funds from the hands of savers to those who want to borrow it. Financial institutions. These are institutions through which savers can directly provide funds to borrowers and is broken into financial markets and financial intermediaries. Financial markets, savers can provide funds to borrowers. Examples are a bond market. Bond is a certificate of indebtedness. And the stock market, the stock is a claim to partial ownership. The other one is financial intermediaries. These are institutions through which savers can indirectly provide funds to borrowers. Examples are banks and mutual funds, which are institutions that sell shares to the public and use the proceeds to buy portfolios of stocks and bonds. The elements of the financial crisis, the year 2008 and 9, we had the financial crisis, and what caused the financial crisis was the problem in the financial system. So, what are some of the elements of the crisis? There was a large decline in some asset prices, which was in the real estate sectors. Housing prices fell 30%. Secondly, insolvencies at financial institutions. In 2008, 2009, banks and other institutions failed when many homeowners stopped paying their mortgages. Third, the decline in confidence in financial institutions. 2008 and 9, consumers with uninsured deposits began pulling their funds out of financial institutions, which caused a credit crunch. During the same time period, borrowers unable to get loans because troubled lenders could not confident in the borrower's credit worthiness. So there was credit crunch, which led to economic downturn, falling of financial institutions, and a fall in investment caused GDP to fall and unemployment to rise, which led to a vicious cycle, which was the downturn reduced profits and and asset values, which worsened the crisis. Let's look at some accounting identities. GDP, or Y, is total income, which of course equal to total expenditures. And the identity is Y equals to C plus I plus G plus NX. Y meaning gross domestic product, or GDP. C is consumption. I is investment. G, government purchases. NX for net exports. We're assuming closed economy to develop this model, so net export is zero. GDP is therefore equal to C plus I plus G, and when we solve for I is equal to Y minus C minus G, which is an expression for national savings. National savings, or S, which is total income in the economy that remains after paying for consumption and government purchases. That is Y minus C minus G. That is total income. Y is total income. After paying for consumption, you subtract C for consumption and subtracting G for government purchases. And it follows that savings equals investment in the closed economy. For T, which is taxes minus transfer payments, S equals Y minus C minus G. We have seen that that is national savings, which can be written as S equal to, in bracket, Y minus T minus C, and that would be private savings. Private savings is total income that remains after we have paid taxes and we have paid for consumption, plus T minus G, that is public savings, which is what remains after government collects taxes and spends it. Whatever remains is public savings. So, budget surplus occurs when taxes is greater than government. When government spends less than taxes, then whatever remains is called budget surplus. So T minus G is positive, that would be a surplus. The excess of tax revenue over government spending, that is what public saving is. Budget deficit is when government spends more than a tax collection, and it is negative, it means less than zero. It is the shortfall of tax revenues from government spending. Okay, that's a negative public savings. Active learning. Suppose GDP equals 10 trillion, consumption equals 6.5 trillion, government spending 2 trillion, and has a budget deficit of 300 billion. Find public saving, net taxes, private saving, national saving, and investment. Given Y equals 10, we are given consumption equals 6.5, G is 2.0, G minus T is 0.3, all in trillions. Public savings, you plug the numbers into the formula and you get negative 0.3. Net taxes is 1.7, private saving would be 1.8, national saving is 1.5, investment is 1.5. If that's number B, use the numbers from the preceding exercise, but suppose now the government cuts taxes by 200 billion. In each of the following two scenarios, determine what happens to public saving, private saving, and national saving and investment. Number one, consumers save the full proceeds of the tax cut. Number two, consumers save 1/4 of the tax cut and spend the other 3/4. The answer: in both scenarios, public saving fall by 200 billion and the budget deficit rises from 300 billion to 500 billion. Number one, if consumers save the full 200 billion, national saving is unchanged, so investment is unchanged. If consumers save 50 billion and spend 150 billion, then national saving and investment each fall by $150 billion. The two scenarios from this exercise were one, consumers save the full proceeds of the tax cut, and two, consumers save one fourth of the tax cut and spend the other three fourths. Which of these two scenarios do you think is more realistic? Why is this question important? Think about that. Meaning of saving and investment. Private saving, that is income remaining after households pay for taxes and pay for consumption. We saw it earlier on. It is Y minus T minus C. Examples of what households do with the saving: buy corporate bonds or equities, purchase a certificate of deposit at the bank, buy shares of mutual funds, let accumulate in saving or checking accounts. Investment is the purchase of new capital. Examples of investment: General Motors spends 250 million to build a new factory in Flint, Michigan. You buy 5,000 worth of computer equipment for your business. Your parents spend 300,000 to have a new house built. Investment is not the purchase of stocks and bonds. Loanable funds market. The supply-demand model of the financial system. It helps us to understand how the financial system coordinates saving and investment, how government policies and other factors affect saving, investment, and interest rates. That's called the market for loanable funds. Assume only one financial market. Economists simplify the world in order to explain it. So the model is to simplify the world by having one financial market. All savers deposit their saving in this market. All borrowers take out loans from this market. This is one interest. There is one interest rate, which is both the return to savings and the cost of borrowing. The supply of loanable funds come from savings. Households with extra income can loan it out and earn interest. Public saving, if positive, in other words, if tax is greater than government spending, uh, adds to national savings and supply of loanable funds. In other words, budget surplus increases loanable funds. If negative, which is budget deficit, it reduces national saving and supply of loanable funds. So here is a model with the upward sloping supply curve, and at 3%, $60 billion is being borrowed. An increase in interest rate makes saving more attractive, which increases quantity of loanable funds. So interest goes from 3 to 6%. More money is borrowed from 60 to 80. The demand for loanable funds from investment. So on the demand side, firms borrow the funds they need to pay for new equipment, factories, and the rest. Households borrow the funds they need to purchase new houses, and the model is a downward sloping demand curve. And at 7%, $50 billion is being borrowed, and a fall in interest rate reduces the cost of borrowing, which increases the quantity of loanable funds demanded. So interest rate falling from 7% to 4% leads to an increase in the loanable funds from 50 to 80 billion. When you put the two together, supply and demand, the interest rate adjusts to equate supply and demand. The equilibrium quantity of loanable funds equals investment and equilibrium savings. So at 5%, the market is at equilibrium. $60 billion is being saved, $60 billion is being borrowed. There's equilibrium in the marketplace. Let's look at the policy implications. Savings incentives. Let's say the government gives people incentives to save. I don't know, save for children's education, save for retirement. Government provides you with an incentive. What happens? Tax incentive for saving increase supply of loanable funds. People respond to incentives. We know that from the 10 principles in chapter 1. So if there's incentives for people to save, there's going to be increase in savings, a rightward shift of the supply curve. Okay, this increase in savings will reduce equilibrium interest rate. So interest rate will go down from 5 to 4, which will increase equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. What about a policy two, which is incentives to investors? Okay, incentive to investors. An investment tax credit would be an example of an incentive to investors. So an investment tax credit increases the demand for loanable funds. And when that happens, it raises interest rate. Interest rate go up from 5 to 6%, and equilibrium quantity of loanable funds increases from 60 to $70 billion. Active learning. Use the loanable funds model to analyze the effects of a government budget deficit. In other words, government spending more than it is taking in taxes. Negative. Draw the diagram showing the initial equilibrium. Determine which curve shifts when the government runs a budget deficit. Draw the new curve on your diagram. What happens to the equilibrium values of interest rate and investment? Okay, there is the initial equilibrium, 5% and $60 billion. That's the equilibrium. And government runs a budget deficit. The budget deficit reduces national savings. A supply of loanable funds, so supply curve shifts to the left. And when that happens, it raises interest rate. And when that happens, equilibrium quantity of loanable funds decreases from 50 to 60. Budget deficits, crowding out, and long run growth. In our analysis, increase in budget deficit causes a fall in investment. Government borrows to finance its deficit, leaving less funds available for investment. That is called crowding out. Okay. Investment is important for long run economic growth. And therefore, budget deficit reduces the economy's growth rate and future standard of living. That is the effect of budget deficit. What do experts say? Fiscal policy and saving. A sustained tax cut and spending policies that boost consumption in ways that reduce saving rate are likely to lower long-run living standards, and 79% agree. 21% are uncertain about it. US government debt. The government finances deficits by borrowing, that is, selling government bonds. Persistent deficits lead to a rising government debt. The ratio of government debt to GDP is a useful measure of the government's indebtedness relative to its ability to raise tax revenue. Historically, the debt to GDP ratio usually rises during wartime and falls during peacetime until the early 1980s. So, this is a history of debt in the United States since the Revolutionary Wars of the 1700s. Uh, this data starts from 1791, and it looked like the Revolutionary War had ended, and the debt to GDP ratio was falling, kept on falling until 1811. I suppose this was then 1812. British attacked the United States and burned the White House. So the War of 1812 raised the debt again. It was a brief war. After that, the debt declined, and by 1830, there was no debt. It was a relatively peaceful period of time for these 20 years until the Civil War in 1860. After the Civil War, the debt came down. This is during the Reconstruction period in the United States. Until, of course, the World War One, the debt ratio went up, and after World War One, it went down, briefly until again there was World War Two, where government spending went over 100%. The debt to GDP ratio, went over 100% of GDP. After World War II, there was a considerable decline until 1980s when we had this sustained increase. This was the first increase without war in the 1980s. And then, of course, the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, this increase in debt was because of that. And the data ends here. Conclusion: markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Financial markets are governed by the forces of supply and demand. They help allocate the economy's scarce resources to their most efficient uses, links the present to the future. Savers convert current income into future purchasing power. Borrowers acquire capital to produce goods and services. In summary, US financial system is made up of many types of financial institutions like the stock and bond markets, banks and mutual funds. National saving equal private saving plus public saving. In a closed economy, national saving equals investment. The financial system makes this happen. The supply of loanable funds comes from saving. The demand for loanable funds comes from investment. The interest rate adjusts to balance the supply and demand in the loanable funds market. A government budget deficit is negative public saving, so it reduces national savings. The supply of funds available to finance investments. When a budget deficit crowds out investment, it reduces the growth of productivity and GDP. And that is the end of this chapter.